It is a true pleasure to welcome you to the 2025 SALTISE conference hosted here at Dawson College. Whether you've traveled from across the city, across the province, or even further afield, we're thrilled to have you with us. It's a very nice crowd, so welcome. As many of you know, Dawson has long been committed to pedagogical innovation and institutional excellence, values that are deeply aligned with the mission of SALTISE. So it really is an honor for us to host this vibrant community of teachers, pedagogical counselors, researchers, and educators. This year's conference theme speaks to the evolving realities of post-secondary education. Our sessions will explore a wide range of topics, from active learning strategies and inclusive pedagogy to the integration of emerging technologies in the classroom. These conversations are more than timely, they are essential. As we navigate an era of rapid technological change and increasing complexity in our educational environments, we must ensure that our teaching practices are grounded in both disciplinary expertise and evidence-based and research-based pedagogy. I want to take a moment to express my gratitude to our keynote speakers and presenters. Thank you for generously sharing your knowledge, your research, and your experience. Your contributions are what makes this conference so rich and meaningful. I also want to acknowledge the many volunteers and Dawson College staff members who have worked very hard to bring this event to life. Your dedication is deeply appreciated. And of course, a special thank to the SALTISE organizing team for crafting and organizing a program that promises to inspire, challenge, and connect us all. Over the next 2 days, I encourage you to fully immerse yourself in the experience, attend the sessions that spark your curiosity, engage in conversations with colleagues, ask questions, share your insights, and don't be afraid to think outside of the box. This is your space to explore, to collaborate, and to grow. So once again, bienvenue à SALTISE et au Collège Dawson. Welcome to SALTISE and welcome to Dawson College. I look forward to 2 days filled with dialogue, discovery, and the kind of collaboration that continues long after the conference ends. And thank you, and let's make this an unforgettable experience. Merci et bonne conférence.
Merci, Isabelle. Now I'd like to call upon the co-directors of SALTISE, Michael Dugdale, Phoebe Jackson, and Selma Hamdani, to add their words of welcome and to say a few words about the conference and the people who have made it happen.
Thank you very much, Chris, and my favorite time of year. Welcome to this year's SALTISE annual conference. It's in our, as we've mentioned, our 14th edition. Bienvenue au 14e congrès annuel de SALTISE.
We would like to thank, Dawson College, their Office of Academic Development, and Dean Isabelle Carrier, ici présente, for hosting this event. We are grateful for the college's incredible support and collaboration throughout the presentation or preparation of this conference and through their support of SALTISE overall. We would also like to thank Director General Diane Gauvin, Academic Dean Leanne Bennett for their support. Un grand merci pour votre soutien tant envers la colloque que envers la communauté SALTISE.
We'd also like to acknowledge and thank our funders and sponsors. SALTISE is a service funded by l'Entente Canada-Québec, administered through Enseignement Supérieur. These funds support all of SALTISE's activities. Un grand merci au ministère ainsi que notre comité d'orientation pour leur soutien à notre communauté. We have also received support specifically for this event from our other sponsors. Their generosity has allowed us to maintain this as a conference without fees, making it accessible to teachers and instructors throughout our network. Thank you very much.
And we wish to thank the members of the Conference Organizing Committee especially its chair, Sueli Bonifim, who I think is hiding over there, for the many hours they dedicated to bringing all the moving parts together to produce this year's event. We also thank the SALTISE community for their enthusiastic response to the call for presentations, resulting in our highest ever number of submissions. We are grateful to the reviewers for their careful and meaningful work, which has resulted in a diverse and an exciting program. And we also want to thank our army of volunteers, coordinated by Amin Raj, Josh Onishino, and Oscar Froelich. And of course, we thank you for demonstrating your commitment to advancing the knowledge sharing of our community of practitioners and researchers.
This year, our conference has over 500 registrants. Yay. Thank you very much for being part of this community and for contributing to the vision of a vibrant and engaging community of educators. Thank you. Oh, no, still me. We would like to encourage you to check out our website, www.saltise.ca. Maybe there was one W extra. Okay. Kind of lost track there. You will find descriptions of the resources that have been carefully curated, the tools and systems we have designed to support sharing and dialogue among educators. Okay. For example, we have My Daylight, a synchronous peer instruction platform with an ever-growing number of use cases.
And CourseFlow, a tool created to help with the process of activity, course, and program design. This year's theme, Connecting Communities Over a Decade, Reflections on Past, Purpose, and the Path Ahead, was partly inspired by the reflective process we've been going through. Our 5-year service agreement is up for renewal, and we've been looking back on the work that we've done and also on the work that lies ahead. As part of this process, many of you participated in focus groups and surveys, and we thank you for that. The feedback you've given us has been invaluable for charting our path forward. The education sector is facing serious and complex challenges. We're navigating the breakneck pace of technological change, growing pressure on students and educators, budget cuts, hiring freezes, and even geopolitical instability. All of this affects our institutions in ways that haven't been seen for generations.
These aren't small obstacles. They are also a call to action, a chance to respond with creativity, courage, and care. Emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, adaptive systems, learning systems, and virtual reality have enormous potential if we stay grounded in human-centered values and remain focused on real educational needs. Les pressions financières, bien que contraignantes, peuvent devenir un puissant moteur d'innovation. Les tensions politiques, de leur côté, soulignent plus que jamais l'importance vitale de la liberté académique et de la recherche éclairée. Dans ce contexte, notre mission commune, qui est de promouvoir l'apprentissage, développer les compétences et tisser des communautés solides, s'impose avec une urgence et une pertinence renouvelée.
And the changes have already started. You may notice if you've been to SALTISE before, the people up at the front have changed a little bit. We are sad to see Liz Charles leave the position of co-director, but she has agreed to take on, with our great thanks, to take on the role of Director Emeritus. That leaves me, though, very pleased to introduce Selma Hamdani and Phoebe Jackson as co-directors for SALTISE. Liz, of course, is an impossible act to follow, but as co-directors, we'll be working diligently to maintain the connection between research and practice and the commitment to community that she has fostered in our group. In the meantime, we hope you find inspiring sessions in this year's program. You can find it at this QR code. Thank you for all of you who offered to present at, and for all of you attending this year's sessions. You'll see posters of the schedule posted around the campus, but you may also want to bookmark our schedule at a glance on your device for quick consultations. Again, welcome. Thank you for coming, and we hope you find the conference inspiring, informative, and engaging. Bienvenue et bonne colloque à tous.
And now we invite Chris Whitaker, this year's Lifetime Achievement honoree, to introduce our first keynote panel.
Thank you. So we're going to do this quickly. I'm going to call or ask Liz to come up onto the stage in front. Liz is the founder and the former co-director, or the now executive co-director. What is she? Emeritus co-director of SALTISE. And she's going to do the job of introducing the panelists in detail, but I'm going to call the panelists up as well by name, and I'd like you to give them a warm round of applause. Our panelists today are Emma Harden-Wolfson from McGill University, Thérèse Laferrière, Université de Laval, Jim Slota from the University of Toronto, Oisey, and Beth Acton from Collège John Abbott.
I'm not sure which mic. This one? Okay. So thank you all for joining us today, and thank you all to our panelists. Starting off with Beth. Beth is a PhD in biology. She teaches at John Abbott College in the biology department. She has been chair of that department for several years and has been on college-wide committees. Beth became involved with working and thinking about instruction when she was part of Let's Talk Science at McGill University. And she is now part of the SALTISE Fellows, and we are very pleased that she's joining us today. Okay. Emma Harden-Wolfson is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at McGill University. She's an international and comparative higher education policy specialist with regional specializations in Central Asia, Canada, Europe, and Latin America. Her research explores how and why higher education policy changes across contexts and the implication of policy change and reform, and also about cross-cutting commitment to increasing equity in higher education. Emma has also been part of the head of research and foresight at UNESCO under the International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean. So, welcome, Emma. Thérèse Laferrière is a full professor of pedagogy at the Department of Studies in Teaching and Learning at the University of Laval. She is an associate researcher in the Institute for Knowledge, Innovation, and Technology, ICIT. She's the principal investigator for the network Periscope, which is the platform exchange, excuse my French, recherche et innovation, persévérance et réussite. And she's been doing this for many years, a very strong network. Her research activities involve network learning environments, and especially learning communities, communities of practice, and knowledge building communities. So welcome, Thérèse. Jim Slota is a professor and president chair in knowledge, technology, and education at the Ontario Institute of Studies in Education, otherwise known as OISE, and that is at the University of Toronto. Since 2005, Jim has led a team of both students as well as designers and developers in investigating new models of collaborative and collective inquiry, which has been coined as knowledge, community, and Inquiry, KCI. He also is very involved in learning communities, and one of the groups that he leads is under the Encore Lab. Jim has been teaching Critical Action Learning Exchange project, CALE, where teachers develop, exchange, and discuss competency-centered curricula. And this is a very important thing that we'll be talking about today, which is this notion of being ready for change, or readiness for change. So welcome, Jim. So without further ado, we'll start off with a little bit of background on, so Michael, let's start, yes. So, of course, in typical style, Michael and I are known for never rehearsing. We just go right into it, so we'll just be cueing each other and hope that the telepathy keeps on working. So 15 years ago, SALTISE was born out of a desire for pedagogues like myself and my colleagues wanted to implement the work that we were doing in research. So we were doing lots of research, finding out lots of really important things about what needed to change for students' success, because that was the only goal we had. How do we make our students learn better, especially for things that are difficult? And that desire for bringing people together, desire for making the transition from research into the classroom, into practice, was what bore SALTISE. Next, Michael. So we started off as approximately 10 to 15 people and slowly grew into an interinstitutional, interorder, interprovincial group of individuals who we would encourage to gather once a year, next slide, into something like this, into what you're seeing today, the experience today. Next slide. So we're going to invite you to bring out your technology, because that's part of what we also do in research, was figure out what the technology can do and in the practice. So we want you to do a poll, and once you can indicate that you've got the QR code, hopefully there's enough there. Our question to you is, when you think of SALTISE, what's one word or phrase that comes to mind? Oh, for those of you who don't have connection, maybe you can try. You can try the Wi-Fi. So, community, collaboration, active learning, educational excellence, network. This is wonderful. Next slide. You are telling us what we also found when we did a 5-year survey to find out what do people think about when they first think about SALTISE. And for us, that was really heartening. When people tell us that what they think about is community, that's really good. We want you to feel like you're part of a community. We want you to feel that this is why we're together, because we all lack community. That's something that I think is ubiquitous in this world. We need to know that other people care about the same things we care about, and we need to have a way to have some sense of agency to do something, and you can do it when you're together. That was why we started SALTISE with that small group. This is why we continue it with you today. So next, Michael. So just to give you an advanced organizer, because we all know that everyone needs an advanced organizer or pre-class reading or whatever you want to call it. Yeah. We want you to know there are a couple of words that we're going to be talking about. One of them is communities of practice. That's Etienne Wenger's definition. We're going to be talking about that today. Next slide. Okay. We're going to be mentioning a word that nobody, or a phrase that very few people have heard, myself included, until I came upon it. It's called systems convener. But it's also Etienne Wenger and his wife, Trainer, Beverly Trainer. So the Wenger Trainer 2021. It's a really interesting word because when I started reading it, it was describing what we are at SALTISE, which is we bring communities together. We are a community, but it's more of an ephemeral community because we come together only once a year, or maybe during the webinars, or maybe through our newsletters. But more than anything else, we're bringing you together. So you don't know each other. So what are systems that we're convening? Are all your local communities. We're bringing you together today. That's what it's all about. So that's a word that you're going to hear. And next, Michael. Now, next poll. We're going to get you active a little bit before we settle down. So it should have saved it. What repertoires, which means tools, practices, habits, or ways of thinking, have you developed or shared through your involvement with SALTISE? Notice that we like to walk the walk and talk the talk. So we get you engaged in ways by preparing you to listen to our panel. So if you don't know the answers, you think they're all fuzzy to you, that's okay, because we're going to talk about it. Okay, Michael, let's just see. Peer collaboration, peer learning, ALAs. Okay, there we go. If someone can read them out, student-centered learning, flipped classroom, peer instruction. Oh, wow. Lots and lots of really cool things. And I know that people in the back can see it best. So if I've missed anything, my daylight, whoa, I love it, I love it. AI, oh my goodness, fantastic. So now that you're all warmed up, I'm going to now turn over to the questions to our panelists. So next, Michael. Okay, so for all of you, the question is, can you define change? So specifically, I want to ask you, how do you define change within the context of your work, which is research or practice? So I'd like you to do that, and then I'm going to ask you, what do you consider the key levers for change in your context? Are they tools, values, norms, roles? So if you can hold on to those two and answer them. So I'll start off with Beth.
Look at me.
Oh, no, you can throw it to, because all of you will have that turn.
So my role today is mostly to represent the practitioner in the classroom. So I started where you were many years ago, and now I'm here, so get excited. I think for me, with the definition of change within my work is making changes as a means to improvement. And as was mentioned in my bio, I sit on many committees, I'm a department chair, I still teach, so I'm still in the classroom. But what I'm looking for when I'm looking at change is I'm trying to make an improvement on behalf of my students. And that's really at whatever level I'm at and wherever my action is. It's student-centered, positive movement towards improvement. And those are words that Liz would say, what do you mean by improvement and why are you looking for those things? So she would ask me to go deeper. But for me, at the essence, it's a positive movement towards something better.
Emma, go ahead.
It's a deceptively difficult question, I think, to start our panel off. It sounds easy. If anybody actually has a better, I'm sure that could have been the QR coded question there for everybody else. Over the last 20-something years, I've had the joy, the privilege, the pain to be working in higher education across a whole bunch of different roles. career actually as a translator and then in communications. I moved from there to working in university administration across a number of different countries before hopping over to the side of the fence where I currently sit, which is in a more kind of academic position. So with that researcher hat on, I'm going to give you a nice academic answer there, which is this is a really difficult question. There's no simple answer. So for me, I think about change, and I think about change all the time. It's kind of cuts through everything I've done, both professionally and academically. So I think you can think about change both as a process, but also as an outcome of that process. So when we think about change as a process, we often think about it, and I think you alluded to that as well, Beth, as something that goes from somewhere to something else. Now, when we think about it like that, that could make us think about something that's quite linear or straightforward. And I think we're all aware that the reality is a lot messier, and it might not even be, a 1 to 2. It might not be start here, finish here. We might have to go back or forwards around again. So that's why I think it's really important to think about the process of change. How does it happen? How does it unfold? Who's involved? What are the barriers? What are the things that enable it? And we can also then think about change as the outcome of that. So what happens as a result of when we finally think that we get to the end of that. And I think then, in that sense, change is something that could also be both proactive and reactive. So when we're thinking about proactive change, it's something that we can easily identify or see or plan for. Reactive change, on the other hand, might be a kind of change where we don't even see it happening. And what you have to do, as I think you are with the conference today, is to do that kind of stock taking, to say, well, can we go back to 15 years ago, 14 years ago, to the first SALTISE, and where are we now? And by doing that, that's when you might also have seen how things have changed. So change can happen in a number of different ways, and I think a bit later on I'll give some examples that try and put a bit more flesh on that as well.
Thank you.
Well, change. When I look at it in my own work as a teacher, educator, research and practice, I will say that it involves some professional development. It involves also some bottom-up process, as you mentioned, and a bit of top-down. And also, for me, it involves a lot of a collective dimension. What I mean by that is that, especially talking about SALTISE, community came up, So it is a collective enterprise. Especially, we can do, and the collective begins in one's own classroom. How you understand change. Often I've overcome a number of obstacles to change, but the final obstacle was almost the student attitude. And especially the A+ student and the A students, sorry about that. But those are the winners in the school system. And changing their own role, son métier d'élève, we say in French, sometimes there is a risk in that. And I often found that it was the B+ students who were a bit more willing. They had a bit less to lose than the A and the A+ students. So this is why participation has to be key for change. How you participate in the community, how you change, how you're going to behave in a classroom. I remember in '95 when we started with a laptop classroom. Could not go the same way with a laptop in front of you. It had to be less transmission. It had to be more participation, more active learning. But to make the switch was difficult. And it involves the people with whom you may be working the most closely with. I just gave an example at the classroom level, but we could go on at other levels later in the conversation.
Those are all good.
Yeah, we know.
I'll think about for a minute the ant on the turntable, the famous physics problem where the ant describes the world as it's going around on a record player. That's a record player is for some of you. Vinyl, yeah, vinyl's new again. I feel that I am, sort of so there's change that's happening to me, right? I've grown over the last 25 years into a really different person, and so I'm changing. My world is changing. I think our institutions are changing. When I first got to my professorship, there were 55 full-time tenure stream professors. Now we're at 20, we're less than half of that. And it's all sessional instructors. And these are kind of neoliberal forces that are coming into our institution and changing them. So that change is happening to me. I think my PhD students are facing a world that's changing. So there's a global change even around the institution, and we have different pressures for change. So that turntable is sort of tumbling down a hill in an avalanche right now, and you have disruptive forces like AI coming in that will also affect everything in spite of efforts not to change. I was talking to Torres earlier about how and for 25 years I tried to change schools, and you try to change schools and you're not going to succeed. But try not to change schools. Too much feedback here, and you won't succeed. So change is going to happen. And so I think for me the difference is there's the change that's happening to me and to the world and the disruption, and then there's the change that I want to see, that I feel is important to me, that I want to make, that I want to have happen. And those are the relativistic aspects of that are very important to me as I get older. That you can want to see a certain change, but you got to be aware of the change that's also happening and try to find resonance there. So for me, participating in change that's actually going on is becoming a higher priority, and being aware of all the changes in which your change might be the ant on a turntable that's tumbling down the hill.
So, next, Michael. So, given that we've got a bit of a context, I'm going to move on. Unless anybody wanted to add a little bit more to that lever of change.
I got two things on that.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, especially one thing. The one about be the change you want to see. If you want to see active learning happening in classrooms, get into your own classroom and do active learning. And then just kind of the climate will build around you on that, and you'll see the kind of discussions you can have that build change around you. And the other one is the young people. I think trust, the younger generation coming up, because their voice is going to help push you to a much more solid place that's not kind of what we could call tone deaf to the real world. Because as you get older, you get stuck in your own narratives. You get stuck in your own, version of history that's branched off at this point. So whenever you have the young people around you and you can connect with them and let them help you decide where that change is going to happen, I think that's what it is.
Emma, go ahead.
Take that from a different perspective, right? So I do a lot of, I think of myself as a kind of macro thinker, not an economist, just to be clear. But because I've had opportunities to think around how higher education systems work, right, across a number of different contexts. So thinking about that globally, but also in comparative perspective. So you also get these levers for change. So, in addition to what's been said, you're also getting these levers for change coming from the top down. So I'm often looking from a policy perspective, right? What are the kind of tools and levers that governments have available to them, even if we're in a context where higher education institutions are very autonomous, like they are here. We hope they remain the case. That remains the case. So I think that's also when we think about what are the tools for making change happen, I think it's also important to bear those kind of policy tools in mind. So at UNESCO, one of the pieces of work that I did was commission a series of case studies on the right to higher education. So taking a really rights-based approach to access and success in higher education. And then looking across those 15 national case studies, although there's a lot of course, contextual difference and complexities, I could see there's sort of 6 overarching areas in which governments use policy to try and induce change. So those, in this particular example, were funding for students, information, infrastructure, by which in this case I mean either renovating, let's say, or building new universities or accommodation, pathways into higher education, particularly for students that have historically been marginalized from the education system, quotas, regulations. Now, if you teach or if you've learned about policy, you'll know that governments have lots of other kind of tools in their toolkit. Those are the ones I just wanted to highlight from some recent work that I've done with UNESCO. So I've seen those in action and how they've been used for that particular case. So I kind of wanted to add that perspective as well when we think about these levers, these tools.
No, thank you. Thank you, Emma. I'm going to move on to the next because I don't want to lose time. And the next question for Therese and Jim, can you briefly, and we'll do it very brief, tell us a little bit about the literature on communities of practice and what are repertoires so that people can understand what is it that they might be changing, because a repertoire is something that is alive.
Yes, but I would like to say something before. I would
absolutely.
like to give it a bottom-up twist. Okay, you did it the other way. Often what I've experienced is that it is something that catches your attention. It may be someone coming with something new. It may be a tool, coming back to the levers. It can be a new theory. It can be a new instrument. And then people get interested in that. And they are wondering, how could that affect their practice? Then you start that way. And it brings back to Vygotsky's basic triangle. You know, the subject is interacting with an object, and there is a mediation. And the mediation could be a tool, an instrument, language, or whatever. And then if we go to Engstrom, for instance, then you start adding a couple of more triangles, because you start looking at how the roles will evolve out of that. For the roles to become a bit more static somehow, you need the policies. So, but go with the cultural dimension of communities of practice.
She wants me to go first on communities of practice because it's a terminology that, if you study this, you are disturbed often by people's misuse of the term. And they often think of a community of practice as like a community that's about practice, or a community of practitioners. And before Wenger, in 98, there was Levenwenger in 1985, but before that, there was Jean Lade in 1972, and she was a cultural anthropologist. And I think kind of a Darwin or a Newton of the field, in a way that she noticed something that was profound, which is how, okay, I can't hear myself now, so there's way too much feedback. Sorry about that. How does a group of people hold together over time? Why does a group of people, like a school or a bus station or a convenience store, hold together? And it's basically through a set of kind of co-reinforcing practices and participation in those practices. And so she was studying midwives, for example, in New Guinea. For 30,000 years, they managed to go with that practice and those patterns of practices. And nobody ever, just like Newton, no one ever thought why something falls down. How can midwifery stay for that long without any rule book or any school for it, right? And then the concept is this community of practice. So there is participation in those and peripheral participation. And, in my mind, a COP, as far as the school is a very good example of a community of practice. You've got probably hundreds of co-reinforcing practices, and probably a better lens for understanding why change is so hard in a school or a higher education than any sort of mechanism. Like if you want to build a professional learning community or a community of practitioners, that's fine. But a community of practice, most people that are in one don't think of themselves as being in that. They're just part of the bus station, and they do their piece of it, right? So COP for me is a powerful idea, but I just want to kind of start by getting it right, and hopefully people will, whenever you hear somebody say it's a community of practice, they're probably wrong. Or they're right, but it's a slightly different way.
Maybe we'll give Therese just.
She's going to build on this, and I think Wenger's latest stuff with Repertoires is probably. It's probably very useful, but right now, in terms of communities of practice, there's so many books upon books about why schools don't change, right? It started with Tyack and Cuban in 1995, and then Andy DeSessa 2000, and then Collins and Halverson 2010, and they all say the same thing. Why are schools the same today as they were in 1960? And the reason is they're a community practice. So I'm not saying we shouldn't change them, and again, try not to change them. They're going to change, in some ways, and how they change, I think, is going to be more affected by the climate around them. This disruptive feature of AI, for example, coming into schools, that is going to make some changes. So now I'm going to hand it to Therese.
Yeah.
Okay. So
no, she doesn't need it.
in 91, Lev and Wenger they wrote their book, Situated Learning. This is why Leif was first. This is why I wanted you to go first. And in 98, Wenger came up with his own book on communities of practice, and it was translated in French by Fernand Gervais with the Presse de l'Université Laval. But the main insight within the 91 book was that learning happens as somebody becomes more and more competent in a community. So that's the social theory of learning. To look at participation. More and more you participate. It starts with the kid, and this is why we go back to Vygotsky and Lev and Wenger. They were sociocultural people, all that from Vygotsky. And it was language is a wonderful mediator between the subject and the object. It starts that way. So to be more and more competent in a community which has values, which has tools, which has artifacts, all that is extremely important. That's the approach. Another, in the 98 book, there is one figure that's extremely important. It's like a yin and a yang. It's participation. You have to participate for change to happen in that community, or just for the community to be alive. And you need a good number of people to participate at a rather good level, and not only the same ones participating all the time. And the yang is something else. The yang is reification. I don't know if I pronounce it properly in English. So you need both. You need participation and reification. Because when you work online, you're already creating some reification. It's already there, and yet you can build from that. And Liz and I are going to present something at ISLS, looking at two communities, SALTISE on the one hand, and TAC, which stands for Technology for Advanced Collaboration Among Teachers. It's a community of practice I began in '95. So this participation and reification is extremely important. And it brings us to the notion of a shared repertoire. It's through reification that you build a repertoire. And this repertoire is extremely important. And it's not only, I've seen many communities of practice having an online activity and just posting stuff, all documents. Of course, you need some background, but almost nothing live. And this is often where communities of practice get stuck for me. They don't negotiate meaning enough. They don't negotiate their practice. They don't identify a problem, which could become a shared problem, and then you try to look at how you're going to address that. So you're not intentional. That's right.
So I'm gonna, that's a perfect place almost to launch to the next piece. Okay. Because I think that, what we're trying to do here today is to have the start of that dialogue that you're saying, that intentional reflection on what are our practices, how are they changing, or how might they change with external pressures. So let's move to the next part, which is, Beth and Emma. So Beth, what are those repertoires? What are those, by the way, the words, just simplify the words for yourself. If you don't like the word repertoire, replace it, with practice. So what are the repertoires, tools, practices, ways of thinking that Therese just pointed out that are emerging through your work? And maybe you can add the reification, again, to use the words that Therese has introduced to the conversation. What are the concrete things? A reified thing is something concrete. You can hold on to it. It's a text message. It's a table. Those are the kinds of things. It's an active learning classroom. It's a whiteboard. So what are those things, Beth?
I think they vary, and they'll vary in their use. Who's more comfortable with a particular tool? A big piece of what I've been working on over the last few years, and many of you have been doing, are program revisions. And so a tool we've been using there quite extensively is CourseFlow for a backwards design perspective, to make sure we have an artifact that remains, that we're able to onboard new teachers, that administration understands decisions that have been made for pedagogical reasons. And so I think the repertoires that we're building, I call myself the accidental pedagogue. I always say how, not why. So I think in a lot of those ways, the how is important, and it's critical for the practitioner in the classroom to understand the use of the tool and what it will provide for the teacher in the classroom. A lot of conversations around change for policy, they're not happening at the front of the room with your 1,000 or 40 students, however many you happen to be teaching. They're happening sometimes at other levels. And that lack of communication sometimes, that lack of intentional discussion with teachers as to why decisions have been made at a college or a program level, I feel that's sometimes the missing piece from the repertoire. And I wish that communication was a bit more intentional. It's one of the big things I push is making sure new teachers understand there are exit profile goals for our programs, because a new teacher comes in and they teach their class. And it's outside of the context of the program and everything else the student is doing. So I wish we leaned more into some of these tools to help with communication of the changes that we're making and the reasons or the intention why we're making those changes.
Wow, nice. Emma, here's another question. Same topic, but a little deeper for you. How do norms and practices change after micro-level change?
So this is such a generous invitation, and there's so much I'd like to talk about. But what I will try and do, and cut me off if I'm going on too long or getting too excited, is do this in sort of 3 parts: past, present, and possible futures, right? So let's start with the past. I want you to imagine, and some of you in this room are far too young, so you're going to have to just remember these historical movies that you've watched. But it's 1991, okay? And we are in a place which no longer exists. We are now in what was the Soviet Union. And you're a faculty member working in a college or in a university there. And all of a sudden, this regime, which has been built up and reified from the top for some 80 years, overnight, it's gone, disappeared. And here's how you might feel about it. This is an analogy that was given to me by somebody a faculty member who lived through that period of time. He said, the collapse of the Soviet Union was like finishing university and your life being totally different. Like you were picked up and sent somewhere far away, but you have to find a way to live. You don't know the language, you don't have any income, your work isn't guaranteed, nothing. You have to survive. And this feels like a bit of a kind of a gear shift from some of the things we're talking about. This kind of change, because we are talking about change, this kind of change is very rare. And here I'm drawing on work that I did in my doctoral thesis, my PhD thesis. And I think about these kind of very rare moments as like avalanches, yeah? They don't come along very often, but when they do, boy, do they move fast. And boy, do they have a really huge impact. So the reason I wanted to kind of share that story, that this faculty member, the analogy that they gave to me, was to help us think through what happens after that kind of moment of major political, social, economic change. Because if you look at the literature, and as a good academic, we have to tie these things back to what the literature says, it goes one of 2 ways. Either after a period of like immense change like that, everything changes because there's been this big macro change, or nothing changes. And we get stuck, basically, because the enormity, the magnitude of what has happened is so big, we really can't then do anything.
It's happening in Cambridge, Massachusetts right now.
Well, there are contemporary realities. So I think sometimes by setting things in this kind of historical past, you can then also draw lessons, right? We can understand and see how that's playing out today, whether in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or elsewhere in the world that's perhaps not so well known. So in the end, what I found through this piece of research was that how do you respond? My question specifically was working with faculty members. So that's why I wanted to share it with you, because I know a lot of you are in the classroom or you work with people who are in the classroom. How do you deal with those kind of moments? Well, yes, there are major changes that are made. You have to, if all of a sudden the ideological basis of your teaching in Marxism-Leninism is suddenly delegitimized overnight, you can't teach that anymore, so you have to teach something else. So we see a lot of major changes happening, In the post-Soviet region or in the former Soviet region, it would major things, new universities coming in, new international partnerships, your country or the union's been closed before and it opens up. But we also see a lot of incremental change, and that's what I was alluding to before. It's the kind of change where you have to sort of look back over time to see where things have shifted. But you also find resistance. Now, you can talk about that as continuity. Continuity is the flip to change, right? It is a kind of change. In this case, in some cases, it's like a purposeful choice not to change. And actually, the biggest place that I saw that in my study was among faculty. So in the former Soviet Union, a lot of value was placed on working your way up through the ranks. And indeed, I spoke with somebody as part of that study who had been a student at this university in 1956. I think he graduated, did postgraduate studies, then came back. And since the 1960s, all the way through until the late 2010s, had been at that university and worked his way up from being, you know, a junior, a postdoc, to a lecturer, eventually to running the institution. So that kind of value, those kind of norms are still there. I have a feeling so that's the kind of part one, right? That's my sort of historical piece to help us think about how do you deal with these sort of macro but quite rare changes in the environment, because there are parallels even if we're not living through that particular moment of change that happened back in the 90s. Can I carry on for a bit?
Yes.
As I told you, it was a very generous invitation. So let me turn to the present and let's think about a more local story. January 2024. Federal government decides for the very first time, I can see some nods already, you know what's coming, that they're going to put a cap on the number of international students who can come and study in Canada. That's not a regime collapse, it's not a regime change in the same magnitude, but it is another really clear example of how political shifts are going to impact the way that we do things in higher education. And for many of our colleges, particularly Ontario, perhaps to a somewhat lesser extent here in Quebec, but it's had a devastating effect. It means that programs have had to close. There are huge, either not even hiring freezes, but there are mass job cuts. This has been coupled with, and Jim, you can speak to this from the Ontario context as well, an ongoing, just very poor showing from the province in terms of its support for and funding for higher education in the system. So in my more recent work, I've been looking with a couple of grad students at McGill University about how do the governments, and here, because we're in the Canadian context, we're talking about this in the plural, how do governments talk about this? How do they show that this is a problem which this new policy is supposed to solve? And that's quite interesting because it's also interesting because, as you know, the federal government has no jurisdiction over education, and yet the biggest education policy for years we've seen in the country came from the Department for Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada. And of course, if you look at the way that they talk about this in the policy announcements, in the justifications for this, of course the governments are not to blame. Not the federal government, not our dear Ministère de l'Éducation et de l'Enseignement Supérieur here in Quebec, not the Ministry of Education in Ontario, not anywhere else. It could be recruitment agents. These are often independent or private sector people working to support students to get placed into Canada because they've been, selling this out on a false promise of saying, come to Canada and stay in Canada. But that's actually a narrative that the government's been giving for the last, I don't know how many years, talking about international students as, and I quote, ideal immigrants. Those are words used by a former federal minister. So is it recruitment agents to blame? Because it's not the government to blame. Is it us? In the CEGEP, in the colleges, in the universities, are we to blame? If you look at the policy announcements, we're probably at best to blame for being a little bit passive in all of this and just kind of letting things happen. But what's really interesting and I think very alarming for us is the students themselves who are often put at the center of that. And this is how the government's sort of justifying this change. So looking at international students, whether they're aware of doing this or not, who are coming here and wanting, having the temerity not only to want to get a decent education by coming to Canada, but actually wanting to stay here as well, and perhaps using some kind of backdoor into immigration, which our former Immigration Minister Mark Miller has told us is now firmly shut. So again, just thinking about what are the implications of this kind of system change for us in educational institutions. If you're in the classroom, you'll see this. If you're a student, you're seeing this. If you're in administration, you're seeing this in the governance. So it really has multiple ramifications. I think I'll wrap up here, and then my third part, which is kind of more future-looking and perhaps a little bit hopeful, maybe I can come back to cheer us up before we go.
So this conversation, this part of the conversation, we wanted to have a little bit of, interaction here. So Therese, Jim,
Well,
how do you?
the way I relate to what you're saying is what the Ministry of Education is doing, the K-12 system, both French and English, but maybe more on the French side, with direct instruction, all the way down, and teachers moving back to teaching with for the test. So that's a direct. That's another example of what you're talking about. It's something happened at the Ministry of Education. A small team of researchers convinced the ministry to move in a certain direction. So we are back to explicit teaching. So what it will do to prepare students with AI coming. The writer and Skardemeijer, they wrote in 93, surpassing ourselves. It was true in 93. Can you imagine it to be even more true today?
Can you repeat that, Therese? What Carl did you
Carl
say?
and Marlene, they wrote a book called Surpassing Ourselves.
Surpassing Ourselves. So
In 93.
Carl Bereiter and Marlene Skardemeijer.
Yeah, and it had to do with the beginnings of knowledge building. But now with the AI, and how students relate to AI, and what they will need to do using AI, how they will need to move beyond, how they will need to surpass themselves, or they may feel surpassed also. So this is how I relate to what you were saying here.
I want to look at K-12 and higher ed, and I think, back to this concept of what's changing around me versus what I'm going to try to make a change. And the kind of commodification of learning that was described by Henry Giroux, where we adopted this industrial model of workforce preparation, and we're going to teach you your fundamental skills so you can go to university and get in the workforce. And that sort of mechanistic understanding of education is dehumanizing of the student. It's disempowering, and it sort of privileges some students over other students. And
it allows for systematized injustice to happen. And people are kind of waking up to that, but it doesn't mean it's not happening. And if you look at the university, so I was always told when I first arrived in the academe that higher education was going to be the last thing to change. My supervisor, or my mentor back then said, forget higher ed, they never do anything innovative in teaching and learning. This was 95, right? So let's focus on K-12. And what's weird to me when I mentioned that I've been growing over the last 30 years, I've kind of noticed the opposite. I mean, higher ed has been forced into change by social, including some of those neoliberal forces that I mentioned. I mean, that this commodification of learning is still strong here, but there's also a much greater diversity now, and I think it's a sort of competition in the marketplace, where if these needs that we have in society are not made up, we need students to have these competencies. And industry needs them. So finally, that puts a pressure on the higher ed. And so when one institution creates a new program with an internship or a co-op, and the other one creates one with true multidisciplinary nature, and this is something I'm experiencing through SALTISE, which I know we're going to come to that with your questions. But that to me has shown higher education to be finally maybe responding in some level in terms of its offering, and it puts these institutions at competition with one another. So you cannot just stay the same if the institutions around you are showing they have something attractive to the better students. K-12, meanwhile, you could point the same finger that I mentioned before. It just doesn't, it resists change, and we can talk about why. But I think as higher ed changes, that will put pressure on K-12 to change too.
Okay. And just to continue on a little bit longer with these external pressures, I think, Therese, you're bringing up some really important pressures that we face in Quebec in particular. And Emma, you mentioned Ontario. I'm wondering from the practitioner side, Emma, Beth, how are you feeling about these changes? And we're trying to bring you back to this notion about why we're all together today. You know, we all agree to some level that our students, in order for our students to learn, we need to engage them in ways. And I think, you know, Therese, going back to your yin-yang circle, it was that participation and the reification of the participation, which is what we see over and over again. So if we cannot do that because these external pressures are beating down on us, what is going to happen to us as a community of people who want to do this?
Yeah, it's difficult. I'm going to avoid the Law 14 discussion, so I'm just going to, with that. I'm going to focus more on the reification, which I think for most of us as instructors in the classroom, it's assessment, right? So how do we prove that our students have participated in change or done that learning? It's assessment, because students need a grade, because that's how we show competency, and then students' grades get them to their next step. So as much as there's perhaps change at higher ed, and then in CEGEP, we're right in the middle of what they're coming in and how do they get into our program, the grades they got in high school. And so I think, to me, and with AI and with knowledge building and content and knowing, what I really wish for would be a way to change how we formally assess students in the classroom. I'm fortunate I teach a single section course, so I can make my own decision, but my students come in with a memory aid. Write down whatever you can't remember, you get one sheet, it's been 5 weeks. This is just equivalent to on the job, looking something up on Google that you maybe forgot, okay? So I'm able to do that. And they don't move on, it's a career program, so the R-score, they're quite happy with their 60, and they move on to their next course. But I really feel we need a systemic change at that level of reification or assessment if we're really looking to truly build change in how students are looking at education, building those transversal skills. The content's kind of becoming almost secondary, I think, to what some of those needs are in society. But we still assess for how many things did they remember from my PowerPoint. And that's what bugs me. That's kind of the thorn in the side, I think, with being able to make a big shift.
So, given, we're getting close to, we want to leave time for a little bit of questions from the audience as well. And we're sort of getting close to maybe a big question. So I'm going to sort of skip a little bit ahead so that you can have more free interactions. So what internal or external factors do you think communities like SALTISE need to consider in the near future? What are those kinds of factors that, I mean, you're pointing out some of the factors that are impacting you in the classroom or globally, where we might be going, and the sort of things like that. So go ahead.
Yeah, I think I'm going to talk to the college teachers.
Oh, hang on a second.
College teachers will have to work harder with the students who will be coming from secondary education, because of the restriction that has started to happen on teachers, the teach to the test. There's going to be a setback. And if you want to have kind of a classroom where there is active learning more, the students will be a bit less skillful in this regard. We have to work harder because of, it's like the pendulum has been swinging back. In the 2000, 2005, 2010, it was a bit more social constructivist. It was direct instruction, but a bit more. Now the pendulum has swung back. Yeah, and then you will have to work harder. And if you are at the university, in a few years you will have to work harder too.
Jim?
I think what Beth mentioned. Hello? That sort of shows the power that a COP has to resist change. When new teachers are prepared, Not sure I'm getting any mic now.
Okay, testing. When we prepare new teachers in Boise, we tell them that they're supposed to be reflective practitioners. We tell them that they're supposed to experiment with their practice. We tell them that there's all these powerful ways of learning through dialogics and active learning and vertical synthesis. And we try, and then they get to their schools, and the messaging that they receive is like, here's your binder.
Yep.
And also, it turns out to be a hugely difficult job. And just surviving, and you're responsible to cover all this depth, and you have all these practices around you that reinforce your sort of snapping back, not to mention your experience as a student that sort of situates you in this COP as well. So this kind of helps you understand why the COP is a powerful kind of explanatory mechanism and why we have so much trouble changing. Our institutions would probably love to see dramatic systemic change, but then you got to change everything and everywhere at the same time. So even with a place like yours where there's a disposition toward innovation, you still have to, fight the assessment norms. And I don't know how those changes happen, but I think something like AI, again, when you try to make a change, good luck, but somehow try not to. And when something like AI comes in, now it's in all of our pockets, and the schools are frantic about how to handle it, and the universities are saying we no longer need to prioritize the same things. I just came back from China last week, and that country is extremely intentional about revolutionizing its instruction in higher education and K-12. Very, very intentional, reflective, high-level community there that are calling it the intelligence era. So I don't know how reflective and intentional our higher level is, but I don't think they're going to have a choice. And so something about the kind of disruptive nature of this intelligence era might sweep in and cause some change to happen that the COPs would otherwise resist.
So again, as we start getting close to the end of, I realize that we're giving you such a small soundbite of this conversation just because of time. We can keep on talking a lot about this because I would say all of you are, we're all pushing back that tsunami of change that is, or we're hoping to push back the tsunami of change that's happening at the systems level. So maybe, Emma, you could talk a little bit more. You said there was a future and some hope.
Yes.
Well, yes, there's a future. But Jim, I just wanted to reflect that your comments you've made me think back to what I was saying before about changes being either proactive or reactive. And I was reflecting when you were talking about perhaps there's something to be said about proactive change being something that we can better prepare for. Reactive change, like, everybody now worrying about, well, we don't have a policy around the use of generative AI, for example. Where actually we have academic integrity policies. Here, we have quite strong data privacy and protection policies. We do have an existing policy framework. So I think it was really helpful for me to think about how do you approach how do those different kinds of change make us feel and respond? So again, I wanted to mention some work that I'd done while I was at UNESCO on the futures, very deliberate use of the plural, of higher education. UNESCO does this kind of once every generation huge project on education, and they chose, perhaps unwisely or unknowingly, in 2019 to start a project on the futures of education. I was working then for an institute focused on higher education, so we took up that kind of piece. So I just wanted to share a little bit about the methodology for that. If you are ever in the lucky position that I got to be in, where my director said, okay, we need to make a contribution to this project, and that was about as much guidance as I got. So in those kind of cases, I thought, all right, how would we know? Right, this Futures of Education project had a 2050 horizon, so that's about 30 years from the point when it was being designed. So I did this in 3 different ways. I first convened a group, and I'm a little bit nervous about calling them experts because I think it's a very kind of constructed and potentially problematic word, but 25 people from around the world who think about and work in and who are in some way have expertise in, or from their authentic context in global higher education. Following that, we then produced an open online survey. It was available in English, French, Spanish, Mandarin, so not all of the world's languages, but 4 of the big language groups. And that was open to anybody who wanted to fill it in and who could access the survey during the period it was open. The third part of that was following up specifically with youth, because what we saw from the public consultation, the survey, was that we didn't have that many youth respondents, and we thought, well, hang on a minute, these are the people who are actually going to take forward these norms, these practices, the change or the not change into the future, not just the here and now, but into the future. So we focused particularly on that. But what was neat was that we asked all 3 groups the same questions. So here, if you have the scope in your classrooms, or you want to somehow try to help think about how can we think about change collectively with students, with youth. Students and youth aren't always the same, but often those demographics overlap, right? So we asked them first, when you think about 2050, you can choose your own horizon, could be shorter, could be longer. What are you most hopeful about? When you think about 2050, what are you most concerned about? So those are 2 kind of starter questions, because they really, you have to get people into that kind of mindset of thinking not just about what's concerning me right now, but where might that go? Project yourself. So there's a lot of different ways. If you get into sort of futures methods, there's a lot of different ways that you can sort of help people to think forward rather than in the now. So those are the 2 kind of, if you like, warm-up questions they use. And it also helps us to understand the kind of world that they envisage, the kind of challenges that they see that might be happening at that point. And then, because we were thinking about higher education, we asked them, how would you like higher education to be in 2050? Again, it's one of these deceptively simple questions like yours at the beginning. There's, what is change? How would you like higher education to be in 2050? But then, because it's UNESCO, and because of this particular interest in really trying to emphasize the social justice aspect, we asked them, how could higher education contribute to better futures for all in 2050? So I know we don't have time to go into kind of the detailed findings from that. So at this point, I'm just going to present that as a way of getting people to think, and to think particularly with students and youth. I did some work last year with a colleague in Kazakhstan in Central Asia, where we went and sat with university students and asked them, what's going on for you in the world right now? This wasn't a futures-related project, but it was a project helping people to think through about global issues, because there are so many. In a session I was in this morning, we talked about climate change, we talked about racism, we talked about some of these other sort of major issues which are still affecting us, and they play out differently for different generations in different contexts. So I think there's a lot of power, both for students and youth themselves, and for us in whatever position we're doing that kind of facilitation with, to help us make sense of some of these really difficult, intractable issues in the now and in the future. But there's also value, I think, in then what we hear about that, because that in turn can lead where we have the scope for action. That in turn can lead us and support us into making changes where we have the agency and where we have the ability to do so.
So what do you see? And so I like that idea of who are we bringing around the table?
Yeah.
This is how I'm going to interpret what you just said. So who should be around this table? Who else should be around this table to, when we come to communities like SALTISE, who else should we be bringing in? If we are systems conveners, meaning that we're bringing people from different places and different levels of our community, our society, who else should be around the table apart from the ones who are here today? I know it's
if we
open.
go with Engstrom, if we look at this expansive learning cycle, he will say all the stakeholders at one point have to be there to identify a solution and try it out and come back and reflect on it.
I like the stakeholder discussion about values and incentives or value proposition. Like, if we were to change as an institution, we would have better graduates, we would have better whatever it is, right? And then kind of make change the thing that you have to do to get to something. I think that would drive change.
Yeah.
I don't know how you do that through SALTISE, but I think you have here probably 15 or 20 different institutions, different programs, different kind of intersections with those vertical stakeholder groups, and if you could norm something about the value propositions within kind of canonical one of those, and then each of these 20 would be able to identify with that stack, and somehow you could create a model, you know, what change looks like in a successful higher education context.
I would actually lean into that, and I would flip your question, Liz, and instead of asking who should be at the table, I would encourage everyone to put yourself at the table. So with as much energy as you have, get involved at the other levels of your college. So it's learning about, again, those big pieces and those big decisions. I'm a biologist, so my best example is seed dispersal, right? Different trees and flowers, they all send out their little seeds in very different ways. Some of them are very aggressive, some of them are much more passive, but they all get it done, and they're able to reproduce themselves through and using different, bear with me, but that's what I think SALTISE, at least for myself and my participation as a fellow, it's given me a little bit of confidence to maybe get a little bit more aggressive with my seeds back at my home institution. And it's by planting those seeds, and it was, I think Therese that was using that circular motion, right? Once that idea starts, and then it starts to pick up a little bit of steam, you know, and you find other people that agree with your seed, and are then able to move and to create, again, that movement, and that movement towards improvement. Whatever your particular, you know, thing is, be it climate, be it transversal skills, student workload. I'm big on that one too. That one, again, another thorn in my side. But I really think that it's within the power of the teacher, and I speak mostly in the CEGEP network, but there are a lot of decisions made by faculty within the CEGEP network, and we do need support from the administration. We do need some buy-in, but we can be change makers. Energy required. Activation energy varies, but you know, we can bring these seeds from these types of conferences. And I was just saying to Phoebe in the hallway, it's always sad that this conference is at the end of the year, because we leave with so many great ideas, and then, well, it's summer, and you know, we come back in August and we're prepping our courses again. So it's yeah. Summer COP. We're you and me, Jim. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we're at time. So do you have, is there someone who wants to ask a question, desperately wanting to ask a question? Okay, there's a brave.
And what I see among a lot of my colleagues is like more than resistance, like absolutely brick walls to change. And it seems to me that like this danger, like change will come, and some people will put up brick walls to change, and then change will come to someone else. So I'm wondering, like, as you proceed as a member of one of these institutions, how do you continue to be open to possibility of change instead of getting entrenched in how all the things we used to do were all the best ways to do things?
So I teach policy, education policy, and this past winter I taught it to a group of students at McGill who take our graduate certificate in education leadership, which means they're mainly already practicing educational leaders. And one of them came with almost exactly the same question. Why is it that there are certain people in my schools, as a school leader, who just don't want to do the things that we have to do when these changes come down? So through the course of the semester, we were able to unpack that a bit. And I think one of the, you know, there's no single diagnosis, if you like, but one of the main issues to this resistance, or the brick walling, if you like, was the scale, the scope, the speed of the change. It was very overwhelming. So in that sense, and we didn't talk about what the remedies might be, but I'm imagining that, I mean, if it's coming down from the province, there's not a lot that, unfortunately, at a school level you're able to do if you're mandated to do it. But is there a way for your leadership in a school to support teachers perhaps more, let's say, empathetically through those periods of change? Because they are difficult. You've been told you're doing one thing, and then maybe the provincial reg changes and suddenly you're having to do your assessment or something in a different way, or you know, that kind of thing. So that kind of empathy, I think, is a really important piece, and communication as well. What you don't want to be in a situation is where you suddenly find out that something is happening and it's already happened. Now, again, it depends where the source of the change is. If it's a regulation or something like that, unfortunately, you might not have very much opportunity to consult in, despite the fact that we're in a deliberative democracy. There should be opportunities for consultation. They perhaps are happening, but not every time in every way. So I mean, I'm a big advocate for like strong communication in any context. So I think in this context of rapid change, that's got to be the key thing, transparency as well. So if you're in a leadership position and you're having to explain another change, you know, the best that you can, don't hold anything back. I think as well, I see that in the university setting that I'm working in, is that resistance builds when it's felt that information is being held back, when it feels like there's a bit of a lack of accountability or a lack of transparency. So I wish I had a good answer for you. I don't have a, you know, this is, you can do this, the seed will be planted. Love that analogy, by the way, we'll be using it. But I think clear communication, commitment to transparency and accountability, and whatever the first thing I said was as well, would really go a long way perhaps to help in that. But it's a great question. I wonder if the colleagues want to chime in.
Well, a short line will be, you know, if you cannot change your environment, don't let the environment change you too much, you know, in these times, yeah.
And I think that SALTISE, for me, there's a local aspect to this where you guys just come here because it's in Montreal and you're all from Montreal and you know each other and there's social networks, but there's also a disciplinary there's an emplacement of the work that happens at SALTISE that I haven't seen in any other conference. So there's something on the ground about the work that happens here that if you look at educational research, even policy research, there's all these kind of findings that give qualitative
statements about teaching and learning. But if you're a practitioner, you look at those findings and you kind of shrug your shoulders and say, but that doesn't, you know, help me teach my bio intro course. You talk about the importance of inquiry, collaboration, and knowledge building, but in the practice, you get down to the real, you know, nitty gritty. And so, yeah, that SALTISE is a local, you know, meeting, but it's also a meeting that I think it's sort of appropriating at some level the research, but also kind of in its own, it's got its own mind about the work that it wants to do. And so I think one thing SALTISE could do better is to reify the specific kinds of findings that are represented here year after year after year. Every time I go to a session, I hear an instructor presenting something that's truly like on the ground, implementing, whether or not it's grounded in learning sciences research. It's something innovative and it's something very tractable. And if you could put AI to work on this, perhaps going through your past proceedings, but like somehow to kind of gather and make visible the work that this group has found to be important, and to some, you know, synthesizing and kind of doing knowledge work on that would be also really cool. But as far as what you could take back home to your institutions and say, well, I'm in this group, and this group is you know, dedicated practitioners who are trying to advance the practice across the disciplines. There's another really cool thing is that there's a kaleidoscope here of disciplines, and finding a way to make that knowledge more visible and more tractable for everybody to have everybody else's, that's my work on learning communities, right? So how this can be a more kind of functional and deliberative learning community, and, you know, kind of make real its findings and make those things something you can take to a board meeting, or you can post on your website, or, you know, social media about it, or whatever. There's something unique about the particular research cutting edge that's happening at SALTISE. That is because you guys are all in the classroom reporting on your own practice. Go try to find that somewhere else. You know, not easy, and especially when it's got all the disciplines. So there's something that kind of uniquely fell out of the localness, the Montrealness, the CHF-ness, the kind of collegiality here. But it's very, very practical. It's very, very applied, and it's very wise. So there's a lot of wisdom in this room. And I think that's probably your key, is to bring that knowledge forward and make it more actionable.
So that's a beautiful way to end. People, those of you who have to leave for your session, to set up for your session, we understand if you're getting up. But thank you very much to this panel and some of the ideas I think that are really, really strong. Thank you.
All right, great.